for you, then you can experimentally address this. And say, okay, I look for the connection between the reward system and the self system. What you could see that in exactly those regions which were strongly activated by the reward, when you won some money, here win versus lose, you saw also strong activity during those items which were personally relevant for you. So that means maybe indeed that our self has some rewarding value for us. Yeah? So maybe when you wake up tomorrow morning, you say, oh, I'm so happy, such a value for me that I'm still myself. Here you see other regions in the reward system. Don't want to go into it, but what is important, also already deep down in subcortical regions, yourself is active. Yourself is not only active up there in the cortex, but it's already up there, down there, very active. So the self, as you probably can very much confirm from your daily experience, your self is everywhere. Yeah? It has its fingers everywhere, but it's nowhere really appears. You never can really get a grip on it. It's everywhere. And indeed, you might say this is very metaphorical, but trust me, we have indeed data which confirm that. The self is everywhere. It somehow modulates everywhere, but it's very difficult to get a grip on that. Of course, now you as a neuroscientist may say, Dr. Northoff, now you showed strong activity during self in reward regions. So then it's very easy. Your self is nothing but reward. Dr. Northoff, go home, your self doesn't exist. But it's not that easy. So then I can say, look, I do further experimental investigations. If the reward and the activity in the reward system can sustain and be normal, while at the same time in the very same regions you have no activity during self, then self and reward cannot be identical. So meaning when both can dissociate from each other, then they cannot be identical. Again, you can go into psychiatry. So we investigated patients with addictions, alcoholism, and pathological gamblers. And when you look at these patients clinically, you see that they have basically a total loss of personal interest. I remember that I had an internationally very well-known concert pianist who, after the divorce of his wife, became alcoholic. And he loved piano playing, but then he had no interest whatsoever in piano playing anymore. So that means that an originally, formally, highly personally relevant activity, piano playing, had no relevance at all anymore for him. So he had no self-relatedness. And obviously you know that addiction has something strongly to do with the reward system. So we did the same experiment in these patients, And what we could see was quite astonishing. Here you can see again the healthy subjects, win and lose, a quite nice distinction. So that's the reward activity. Here, also in the alcoholics, so these were detoxified, so 6 months after the acute withdrawal, you see also sort of a quite well recovery of the reward system. Here you see the healthy subjects, high self versus low self. And here you see nothing. There's no activity at all. So even for items where they crossed high self, they have no activity at all. So basically, they cannot recruit their reward system. Remember, the pianist, when he sees a grand piano in the alcoholic stage, it doesn't induce anything anymore. So meaning it has no value. And if something has no value, of course, you have no interest at all. Yeah? So if this talk for you and all these mind, brain, and blah, blah, blah things have no value for you, you're bored. You just sit there and say, okay, hopefully he closes. Yeah? So value is the central dimension for our behavior and subsequently also for our self and personal relevance. So this is what these studies show. And what these studies show is, and that is important, that indeed it is not exactly identical, because if they have a normal reward system, you would also expect normal activity during high self and low self. But it's not the case. So that means both reward and self can dissociate from each other, and they are not identical. So I can relieve you, you are more than reward, and your self still exists. This sort of led me to question, what then is the self? Where is the self? So in 2008, that was the year before I moved to Canada, an agent in Germany approached me whether he read a newspaper article of mine. So he approached me and asked, would you like to write a book about your research? And for the general audience and lay audience. And I said, yeah, that's an interesting thing, but I would like to make sort of the dry scientific stuff a little bit more lively. So I would like to combine that with sort of a mystery novel. Yeah? So the search warrant for the ego. You can see, remember my title, I've progressed since, now I have the search warrant for the brain. So meet me in 2 years, what I will put under the search warrant. So that's sort of, I wrote that sort of a neurophilosophical mystery novel, which then appeared, which I basically wrote in the transition stage from Germany to Canada. And I remember sitting in the airplane and working on the text because the editor told me I have to improve many passages. So you have to consider that I'm a scientist and philosopher just being used to academic writing, and suddenly you have to express things in a normal way, yeah, so that people can understand you. So basically, you're interdisciplinary Chinese, forget it. Yeah? And so I learned something which I should have learned much earlier in school, but which I didn't. I learned to properly express at least German. So, and what I also learned is to see things more clearly. Because when you have to break down things to a very basic level, you really get back to the basic underlying problems. And that in turn helps me then again as a philosopher, psychiatrist, and neuroscientist. So now, in the last part of my talk, I want to show how that capitalized. So again, the self, the question is, are there any specific regions which really react to the self? And this is a meta-analysis. One of my students, Dr. Peng-Ming Qin, from China did. And he showed that here, look, this region is exactly here in front. When you just do this region here, it's the perigenital anterior cingulate abbreviated as PACC. That really seems to be somehow specific related to the self. You see again all these median wall, midline structure. But this region seems to be something special. You see just the red spot is very lonely there, and that means basically it's only the self which seems to be involved in that region. So the self is only lonely there, but not otherwise. So I show you another picture here. Again, you see these two red spots are the self, and they're again very lonely. Here you see together with other spots. So, and the other interesting observation, which at the time became more and more clear, that in these regions, in particular in this region, the whole set of midline regions show a very high activity in the brain, even in the resting state. So when there are no specific stimuli going on, yeah, when you just basically close your eyes, there's already very high activity in these regions. So I cannot even stretch as high. So the question is, and if there is such a strong overlap between the self regions recruited during personally relevant stimuli and the brain's intrinsic activity, its resting state activity, so it means maybe there's a close connection between the resting state activity of the brain and the self. And of course, phenomenologically, experientially, this makes perfect sense, because even if you don't do particular things, even in dreams, yourself is always present. You cannot escape yourself. So that was a path we then pursued, but in between, we did a little transfer. We moved from Germany to Canada. So that was in May 2009. After everything worked out with the positions, which made me very happy. So we took an extra special shuttle, as you can see here. And my own self was somehow rested, but as I said, I had to work on the German book because there was a deadline that was end of May 2009, so I had to move and I start here, and so you can imagine there was something going on in my brain. And then I arrived here, so with a lot of ideas. So how is the self related to the brain and its resting state? And how is that altered in psychiatric disorders like depression? So I will present you a couple of slides, but first, so for my own neurons, there was a new neighborhood. And obviously, a new neighborhood stimulates new neurons. So I got a lot of ideas, and I was very grateful for the free space, mentally as well as physically, I can have and develop these ideas, particularly from these three branches of disciplines: philosophy, psychiatry, and neuroscience, where after having gone all the methodological acquisition and training for the different discipline, each discipline has its own methodological canon, if you want to say. So you have to learn that. So it took me some years, and now it's the first time in my life that I had the feeling in the new neighborhood that I could really link the three and now go ahead and become creative. So, but same question, because it's not only the question I took with me, but my own self. I can travel as much as I want. Myself always comes with me in positive and negative ways. So again, what happens in these midline regions? So again, Dr. Pengming Qin from China, who first contacted me in 2008, he was interested in the self. And when I started here, he was one of the first who came. He came in beginning of June, so he basically came 1 month after me. And so he did a meta-analysis, and he had a very genius idea. Let's investigate all those regions in the brain which show a high resting state activity, here called default mode network DMN. Don't worry about the expression. And compare them with those regions where you show an overlap of the self. And you see again, here this region is again spared, and there's a strong overlap. This basically is a take-home message between self and resting state, particularly in the anterior regions. So that really led me to say maybe the brain's resting state is very important. So just a short reflection. I stand here on a certain ground, and the podium stands on the floor, but without the floor, neither the podium